My name is Elena Vance, and to the United States Navy, I am Rear Admiral Vance, an officer entrusted with live strategy and silence. But to my family, I've always just been the inconvenient daughter, the shadow behind their perfect legacy. At my sister's wedding in Newport, they seated me near the kitchen, ignored my name in the speeches, and nearly threw away the one gift I spent months choosing. What they didn't know was that I came to that wedding with something far heavier than a present. I came with the truth about them, about the lies they built their empire on, and about the silence I was done carrying. Before we begin this story, I want to ask you, where are you watching from? And how old were you when someone first made you feel small for being too good? Don't forget to subscribe to Subtle Revenge Stories for more powerful stories like this. They called it an embarrassment, my uniform, my stars, my service. The same uniform that had survived war zones, open sea storms, and buried rescue missions. That morning, as I drove along the Rhode Island coast toward my sister's wedding, I kept replaying that message from my mother. Elena, for God's sake, don't wear that uniform. It's an embarrassment to the family name. 10 words, but they landed like a punch straight to the chest. I'd worn that uniform into classified briefings, into combat, into moments where the weight of decisions could break a lesser person. And yet to the people who shared my blood, it meant shame. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Not because her words surprised me, but because I had dared to hope even for a flicker that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I had hoped that champagne flutes and white roses might mask the cracks in our family facade, or that the sound of ocean waves might somehow drown out the years of polite rejection. But even before I arrived, that hope was shattered by that text. And if you've ever been made to feel small for the very thing that made you strong, then maybe you understand that cold that enters your bones not from winter, but from a lifetime of dismissal. What stings isn't just being left out. It's being allowed in only when you're invisible. That's what they wanted: a shadow in beige, someone forgettable who'd blend into the linen and floral arrangements. But I wasn't a shadow anymore. I had spent too many years quietly swallowing their absence, their rejections, their calculated indifference. And the final cut had come not from that message, but from the moment I opened a social media app 2 weeks earlier and saw my sister Eliza twirling in joy on the deck of the Ida Lewis Yacht Club, a place I'd known since I was a child. She'd just gotten engaged. Hundreds of smiling faces, congratulations, and family photos. My name was nowhere. I wasn't tagged. I wasn't mentioned. I wasn't even in the background. It was as if I didn't exist. That wasn't carelessness. That was a message. The kind that doesn't yell. The kind that slices you clean in half. Have you ever had someone look through you? Not past you, not over you, but through you. Like you were just air. Tell me in the comments, because that was the day I stopped hoping. That was the day I decided I would no longer show up as the invisible one. I would walk into that wedding in my service dress white. I wouldn't come as the sister. I would come as Rear Admiral Elena Vance, and I'd let them feel every ounce of the weight they tried to deny. They say you should never read too deeply into social media, that it's all just curated joy. But when the album went live from Eliza's engagement party, I wasn't looking for joy. I was searching for a trace of myself. A name, a photo, even a caption. Something. Anything. Instead, what I found was erasure so complete it was surgical. There were shots of her dancing in a gown I could never afford, smiling beside our parents like the star of a world I had never belonged to. I scrolled endlessly, hoping maybe there had been a mistake. But mistakes don't come with filters, professional lighting, and printed hashtags. This was intentional. I wasn't part of the celebration because I wasn't part of the image they wanted to project. That realization didn't make me cry. It made me still, so still I could hear the silence in my Norfolk apartment press against my skin, The next blow came days later in the form of a thick cream-colored envelope laced with the scent of my mother's favorite perfume. Lily of the Valley. A scent I'd come to associate not with comfort, but with distance. I opened it carefully, instinctively expecting some handwritten note, maybe a message acknowledging my service, my time away. But there was none, not even my name. The envelope was addressed to the Vance family, Norfolk, VA, as if I were a department in some corporation. The invitation itself was all elegance embossed lettering, golden edges, a QR code for RSVP. But it wasn't an invitation. It was a formality, a performative gesture designed not to welcome me, but to notify me. I wasn't being included. I was being tolerated. That's a dangerous distinction. In that moment, I didn't feel sad. I felt cold. The same cold I've felt at sea, miles from land, when the wind cuts through you, and you understand that nature doesn't care who you are. My family didn't either. I wasn't their pride. I was their deviation. Their discomfort wrapped in metals they couldn't pronounce. That night I didn't drink. I didn't rant. I called Ben Carter. He picked up on the second ring, just like always. "Admiral," he said, calm and steady like an anchor I didn't realize I'd been drifting toward. I didn't ask how he was. I just said, "Ben, they're getting married." He didn't need clarification. The silence on his end was thick with understanding. When I told him they didn't want me in uniform, didn't want me in photos, didn't want me in memory, he didn't console me. He simply said, "Your light is bright enough to black out their entire sky." Have you ever had someone see your worth when even your own family refused to? Someone who reminded you of the weight you carry, not as a burden, but as a banner? Tell me below. Because that was the night I stopped doubting. That was the night I reached for my truth, the truth that hung silently in a garment bag in my closet. That night, after hanging up with Ben, I walked to my closet and unzipped the garment bag. The crisp white fabric of my service dress uniform nearly glowed under the dim hallway light. The rows of ribbons stitched neatly across the chest whispered memories that no one in my family had ever asked about. Each one had a story. Each one had a cost. I ran my fingers along the shoulder boards where 2 silver stars gleamed, earned, not gifted. They called it embarrassing. They didn't know it was armor. But as I stood there in silence, I wasn't thinking about the wedding. I was thinking about the very first time I had worn this uniform, and how, even then, I stood alone. It was graduation day at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. The Navy Marine Corps Memorial Stadium was packed with thousands of proud families, flags waving, brass bands playing Anchors Aweigh with thunder. The air smelled of summer and pride. I was 22, newly commissioned, and I had polished my shoes until they reflected the sky. I had circled my parents' seat numbers on the event map. I had even told the usher where they'd be sitting. But when the moment came when I tossed my white cap into the sky, along with 1,000 others, I looked into the stands and saw only 2 blue plastic chairs. Empty. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I smiled for the photos with my roommates, my brothers in arms, while the void inside me widened. That morning I had gotten a call. My father's voice was clipped and rushed. "Elena, something's come up. A major opportunity in Shanghai. Timing is awful, but we can't miss it." And then, as if rehearsed, my mother chimed in, syrupy and remote, "We're so proud, dear. But you understand. Business first." As if it were reasonable. As if my 4 years of grinding through marine engineering, war strategy, and leadership training were something that could be dismissed with a voicemail and a shrug. Do you remember the first time someone you loved chose something else over showing up for you? Did it change you? Because that day changed me. Later that week, a letter arrived at my new quarters. A crisp check for $5,000 and a note in my mother's perfect handwriting. "Congratulations, dear. Buy yourself something nice, perhaps a pearl necklace." I held it in my hands, stunned by how well they could reduce years of work to a shopping suggestion. I remember standing over the trash can, tearing the check into tiny pieces. It wasn't about money. It was about what they thought could replace presence, pride, and love. And they never stopped doing it. They just got better at pretending. That's when I realized to them I was a ledger entry respectable. When silent, palatable. When convenient, invisible, always. Have you ever torn up something that represented more than paper? Something that once symbolized hope, but turned out to be proof you'd been misunderstood all along. I want to know. Because that night, holding my uniform again, I knew exactly who I was, and exactly who they'd chosen not to see. The funny thing about families like mine is how perfectly they curate legacy, like it's a product line. Walk into the Vance estate in Newport, and you'll see Eliza everywhere. Her high school equestrian ribbons line one hallway. Her Boston College acceptance letter is framed beside her prom portrait, both glowing under custom lighting. There's even a bound leather album dedicated to her 17th birthday dinner at L'Espalier. Page after page of her in a designer dress laughing as our parents handed her keys to a brand new white BMW. They beamed like she'd cured cancer. And me, you'd have to go to the library, and only if you knew where to look. Behind a row of leather-bound Dickens novels sits a single dusty 406 photo me at graduation, arm in arm with my roommates. To any guest, I was just a friend of someone else's child. That placement wasn't random. It was deliberate. I wasn't a stain they wanted to remove. I was a detail they hoped no one would notice. I should have seen it all coming, but the truth is, hope dies hard. I thought maybe if I kept serving, kept rising, they'd see me eventually. But I forgot they were never looking. I remembered the night I told them I'd accepted my appointment to Annapolis. We were sitting in the paneled living room, where every inch smelled of old money and polished wood. My father had set down his crystal glass with a sigh, the kind of sigh reserved for wasted opportunity. "Elena," he said evenly, "the Navy is no place for a Vance woman. Our legacy is built in boardrooms, not warships. You're wasting your intelligence." I remember thinking he just didn't understand. That with time he'd come around. But I was wrong. He understood perfectly. He just valued his image more than my purpose. Looking back now, I realize he wasn't angry that I joined the Navy. He was ashamed, because my choice didn't benefit him. It didn't elevate the family business, or win him more friends at the club. In his mind, I had taken something brilliant and buried it in steel corridors and salt air. My mother didn't protest, but that silence of hers wasn't support. It was strategy. She didn't have to object out loud. She'd just never mention me again, and what they couldn't praise, they erased. When I sent home photos from my first command, no one replied. When I made lieutenant commander, my father sent a text, "Good job. Hope the paperwork isn't too much." That was it. I kept telling myself I didn't care. That service was its own reward, that the ocean didn't need to clap for you. But the truth is, even the strongest soldiers crave acknowledgement not from the world, but from home. Have you ever realized that the people you love the most may never applaud you, not because you're not worthy, but because they refuse to see? How did that moment change you? Because that realization didn't break me. It built me. But it also taught me that sometimes silence isn't peace. It's erasure, dressed as politeness. There's a strange clarity that comes when you stop trying to belong. It doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It builds slowly like a tide rising beneath your skin. After years of tiptoeing through their expectations, dressing down my achievements, to keep the peace, I reached a point of absolute stillness. Not numbness awareness. I wasn't their failure. I was their contradiction. And contradictions don't get framed. They get hidden. But on the ships I commanded, no one asked me to shrink. My crew didn't care about cocktail parties or designer handbags. They cared about readiness, leadership, trust. They looked at me and saw a rank yes, but they also saw a woman who stood with them on deck in freezing rain, who made the hard calls when lives were on the line, who remembered their kids' birthdays and their spouses' surgeries. I earned my respect not through bloodlines, but through sleepless nights and decisions that could haunt a man for years. And they, my crew, my chiefs, my officers, never once asked me to be anything less than who I was. One winter in the Arctic, I remember stumbling into the galley after an 18-hour watch, my fingers barely bending from the cold. A young enlisted sailor, Carter, back when he was just an ensign, handed me a steaming cup of chicken broth. "Figured you could use this, ma'am," he said, eyes straight ahead, voice steady. He didn't ask what I was thinking. He didn't need to. That gesture said everything. That moment, simple as it was, stayed with me longer than any holiday at the Vance estate ever did. Another time, after a classified mission had left my nerves frayed and my voice hoarse, one of the senior chiefs slipped a lopsided birthday cake onto the mess table. No one said a word, but they sang off-key anyway. No press release, no engraved invitations. Just people who saw me, not the resume, not the mistake of a daughter, not the disappointment in a beige dress. Me. And that's when I knew. I wasn't going to walk into Eliza's wedding hoping to be accepted. I wasn't bringing silence. I was bringing presence. I wouldn't be the beige blur in the background. I'd be the woman in white with silver stars on her shoulders. The one who earned her place, even if her family never acknowledged it. Have you ever had to stop chasing the applause of people who will never clap for you? Have you ever looked around and realized the people who truly matter were there all along, just not in the front row? I'd love to hear your story, because when I finally zipped up that uniform and looked in the mirror, I saw not just a naval officer. I saw the woman they tried to erase, and she was done being quiet. It started with a phone call, an unexpected ring on an otherwise quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office at Naval Station Norfolk reviewing personnel files and mentally preparing for a 1900 logistics meeting. The caller ID read Richard Vance. My father. That name had become more of a formality than a relationship. He didn't call. He sent texts, impersonal ones, holiday greetings, short acknowledgments of career milestones, the kind of messages you'd send to a distant associate, not a daughter. So when his name flashed on my screen, I froze. I stared at it for a long second before I picked up, already bracing for the usual chill. But what came through the lines startled me. "Elena, sweetheart, it's been too long. How are you?" His voice was warm, casual, almost affectionate, a tone I hadn't heard since I was a child. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. Still, some part of me, perhaps the younger version of myself, still buried beneath layers of service ribbons and solitude, wanted to believe. So I answered politely. We exchanged small talk. He asked about my health, my staff, my recent fleet operations. His words were smooth, even curious, like he cared. I didn't let my guard down fully, but I admit I relaxed. I let myself imagine for a brief, foolish moment that maybe he was trying. That perhaps the wedding had stirred something in him that made him remember I was more than a tool, more than an image he couldn't control. We talked for 10 minutes. That's longer than we had spoken in years. I shared a few non-sensitive updates about a sonar technology contract the Navy had recently finalized. He listened with interest, nodding along, making thoughtful comments. And then it happened. The trap was sprung so effortlessly, it was almost elegant. By the way, he said, shifting into a clipped tone, I knew far too well your old acquaintance Vice Admiral Croft is involved with one of our portfolio companies. He mentioned they're submitting a proposal for that sonar project. My stomach tightened. He was wondering if you could maybe steer the procurement team a bit, or offer insight on the competition. It would really help the family business. I didn't speak right away. I didn't need to. The silence said enough. Have you ever felt the floor shift beneath you, not because you tripped, but because someone you trusted pulled it from under your feet? Tell me in the comments, because that's what it felt like. Every word from my father before that moment was just scaffolding sweet nothings designed to build the illusion of care. But all he wanted was access. I wasn't his daughter. I was a security clearance wrapped in a uniform. And right then I saw our relationship for what it truly was, not broken, but never built. It didn't take long for the second wave to arrive. Less than 3 hours after my father hung up abruptly when I told him absolutely not, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. I let it go to voicemail at first, but the second call came within a minute. And the third? I knew her rhythm well. She didn't storm the gates. She chipped at the walls. So I picked up more out of strategy than willingness. Elena, she began, her voice soft and drenched in disappointment. I just spoke with your father. He's very upset. You've hurt him. Those 4 words, "you've hurt him," were her opening salvo. Not "how are you" or "what happened," just a well-practiced pivot from request to guilt. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to see how far she'd go. And she didn't disappoint. "You know, everything he does is for the family," she continued. "For Eliza's future. For maintaining what we've built. He asks one thing and you react like he's a criminal." My jaw clenched. She wasn't raising her voice, but her words landed like cuffs. "You've always been so rigid," she added, letting the pause hang in the air. "So military. But family isn't black and white, Elena. Sometimes you bend. For the people you love, you bend. Have you ever been told that integrity is in flexibility? That your unwillingness to break the rules, their rules, makes you the problem? I'd love to know. Because that's the game she played so well. Redefine principle as selfishness, loyalty as defiance. To her, bending wasn't compromise. It was a test. And the only right answer was surrender. She kept talking. About the family business. About timing. About how one small nudge on my part could make such a big difference. Then she shifted to Eliza. "Your sister is under so much pressure. The wedding is overwhelming her. She wants everything to be perfect. And now this drama with your father, don't make her carry that weight too." There it was, the guilt grenade wrapped in silk. I wasn't just disappointing them. I was ruining Eliza's dream day. The entire narrative was clear. I was the selfish one for not helping them commit a federal crime. I didn't argue. I didn't explain procurement law or the uniform code of military justice. I simply said I gave my answer to Dad. It hasn't changed. There was a pause. Then, in a tone laced with centuries of practiced sorrow, she said, "Well, I hope you can live with yourself, Elena." The call ended. No goodbye. I stood in my office, staring out at the harbor beyond the glass, the silhouettes of destroyers lining the dock. They weren't pretty like the yachts in Newport, but they were real, just like the people I served. They didn't ask me to bend. They trusted me to stand. Have you ever been asked to compromise everything you believe in for people who wouldn't cross the street for you? How did you answer? Because I had made my choice. And that choice was about to cost me more than I thought possible. That evening, just after sunset, the final call came. I knew it would. I saw the name Eliza flash across my phone screen, and for a split second I hesitated. She wasn't like our parents, at least that's what I used to tell myself. She cried more easily, apologized more quickly, and always seemed like she was caught in the undertow of their expectations. But I had learned that tears can be weapons too. I answered. Elena. Her voice trembled, immediately coated in that breathy urgency I'd heard since we were kids. Mom told me everything. How could you do that to Dad? He's been so stressed lately. I said nothing. I waited. I wanted to see what role she would choose this time. Victim, peacemaker, accuser. She sniffled loudly, hiccuped, and then launched into her performance. You have everything, she said. Your career, your rank, your own command. You don't need anything. I just want one perfect day, and you're ruining it over some contract. She paused as if letting the implications settle. All I've ever wanted was a beautiful wedding just once for things to go smoothly. The caterer's over budget. The flowers aren't right. The honeymoon to Bora Bora is slipping through our fingers. Her voice cracked on that last line, like the idea of missing out on a luxury suite in the Pacific was a national tragedy. I almost laughed. Almost. because there it was the raw truth. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about loyalty. It was about optics, money, and convenience. I was standing in the way of her curated fairy tale, and rather than fight with facts, she had chosen the oldest tool in the book, the helpless little sister act. Have you ever had someone weaponize their vulnerability to manipulate you? Someone who could make you feel like the villain simply because you refused to be used? Let me know, because that's what Eliza did. She pleaded, she whimpered. She made herself small so I'd feel large and guilty for it. "Eliza," I said quietly, my voice stripped of anger. "This isn't about a wedding. This is about a request that's illegal, unethical, and beneath us both. I won't help." She paused, her breath catching, and then her voice hardened. "So that's it. You'd let our entire family suffer just to prove some military point," I almost replied. Almost. But there was nothing left to say. When the call ended, I stared at the black screen in my hand and realized something terrifyingly liberating. I didn't feel sad, not angry, not even disappointed. I felt done, utterly done. They had tried charm, then guilt, then tears, all to make me surrender my integrity for their convenience. But I wasn't 17 anymore. I wasn't looking for applause or a seat at their table. I had my own table, and it came with 2 stars on each shoulder. The rehearsal dinner was held at a chic restaurant on Bowen's Wharf, a place so carefully designed to look effortless that it practically screamed wealth. The air was filled with the scent of sea salt, white wine, and expensive perfume. Every detail, the candlelight, the floral centerpieces, the live string quartet tucked into a corner had been curated to perfection. Except, of course, for my seat. When I arrived wearing a tailored navy dress and the quiet dignity of someone trained to assess a room before taking a step, I found no name card at the main table. Not next to my parents. Not near Eliza. Not even on the fringe. Instead, a young wedding planner with a panicked smile approached me. "Admiral Vance," she said quickly, her voice slightly breathless. "We've placed you over here, friends of the family table." She gestured toward a small round table tucked near the service entrance. I walked over without a word and sat beside a distant aunt who hadn't seen me since I was a teenager and who spent the next hour asking if I was still in the Coast Guard. To her, military service was a novelty, not a calling. I stirred my sparkling water and watched from a distance. I watched my mother glide through the room like a hostess in her element, all practiced warmth and social grace. I watched my father shake hands, laugh too loudly, toast too often. I watched Eliza glowing her designer gown, hugging her like she'd been sewn into it. She tossed her hair and accepted compliments like they were owed to her. I had been placed out of sight, but not out of view. It was a tactical exile. One designed not to insult, but to diminish. Then came the speech. My father tapped his glass for attention, stood and beamed at the crowd. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate our wonderful daughter, Eliza," he began. "She's always brought light into our lives, her kindness, her elegance, her grace." He went on. And on. 5 full minutes. A tribute to her charm, her accomplishments, her future. He never once looked at me. He never once said my name, not even a polite nod. I didn't exist in that narrative. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who knew your name, who knew your history, and watched them all pretend you were no one? Tell me in the comments, because I sat in that corner while my father publicly declared he had only one daughter worth celebrating. I clapped politely like a stranger. And that's exactly what they wanted me to be. But strangers don't stay silent forever. That night when the lights dimmed and the guests filtered out, I walked the docks alone. The wind off the water was sharp, but I welcomed the sting. It reminded me I was still alive, still burning. And if they thought that was the end of my story, they were about to learn that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one ignored. It's the one who's done being erased. I had spent weeks searching for the right wedding gift. I didn't want to give Eliza something off a registry or send a check like a distant cousin. I wanted something meaningful, something that tied us to history, to family, to something real. I found it in a quiet little antique shop in Annapolis, a heavy brass maritime compass from the 1940s. It was worn, but proud like it had seen storms, and still pointed true. I had it engraved with the date of her wedding and the geographic coordinates of the small Newport chapel, where our grandparents had been married. To me, it was a symbol of guidance, of legacy, of something steady in a world that had spun out of control. I wrapped it in velvet, boxed it carefully, and held it in my lap throughout the dinner, waiting for the right moment. Toward the end of the evening, during a lull in conversation, I approached the main table. I walked slowly, calmly, as I always had in uniform, though this time I was dressed in civilian clothes. Eliza looked up, her smile more out of habit than warmth. "Oh, thanks," she said quickly as I handed her the box. She opened it, glanced inside for less than a heartbeat, and set it down beside her bread plate without comment. "This is gorgeous," a guest across the table said, pointing instead at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. Eliza turned immediately, her eyes lighting up. "Isn't it stunning? Dad had it custom made in Milan." Just like that, my gift disappeared. Not literally, but emotionally, spiritually. It vanished. I watched the compass sit there untouched as dessert was served, and laughter filled the room. Later, as people rose to leave, a waiter began clearing the table. I saw his hand brush against the box, nearly sweeping it into the tray with napkins and crumbs. My heart clenched, not because of the object, but because of what it represented. That compass was me, my history, my values, my effort to build a bridge that no one wanted to cross. I stood. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't cause a scene. I just walked out unnoticed down the wharf and into the salt air. The wind slapped against my skin, cold and honest. There were no tears. Not anymore. That phase had passed. What filled me now wasn't grief. It was clarity. A clarity sharp enough to cut through every excuse, every manipulation, every delusion I had clung to for years. Have you ever given someone your heart wrapped in something small and watched them throw it away without even realizing they'd done it? Share your moment. Because that night on the docks of Newport, I stopped being the sister. I stopped being the daughter. I became something else entirely, a woman unburdened. And in that space they left behind, I began to build the only kind of legacy they'd never understand, one that couldn't be bought, silenced, or erased. There's a moment when pain transforms, when it stops being something that weighs you down and becomes something that sharpens you. That moment came for me in the quiet of my hotel room, hours after the rehearsal dinner. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the unopened bottle of champagne the hotel had left in my suite, likely a gesture for the Vance family guest. I didn't touch it. I didn't need bubbles. I needed clarity. That clarity came not from anger, but from command instinct. I hadn't survived combat deployments, political warfare inside the Pentagon, and the weight of 2 silver stars by reacting emotionally. I survived by gathering intelligence, assessing the battlefield, and striking with precision. So I opened my encrypted laptop, the same one I carried on classified assignments. I logged into a secure channel and called the one person I trusted without reservation. Ben Carter answered on the first ring. "Admiral," he said, alert, but calm. "I need everything you can find on Vice Admiral Croft," I said. My voice wasn't angry. It was clinical. Specifically around the Orion incident. I want the raw reports. Audio logs, witness statements, anything that wasn't in the public record. He didn't ask why. He didn't hesitate. "Roger," that he replied. "Give me 12 hours. I closed the call and exhaled slowly. Ben wasn't just my executive officer. He was the hub of an informal but fiercely loyal network of officers, people who had seen firsthand how Croft's ambition had left bodies in its wake. Revenge wasn't what I wanted. Revenge is messy. It's reactive. What I wanted was justice, cold, clean, undeniable. And I wasn't going to hurl accusations. I was going to build a case that would detonate on impact. Have you ever reached a point where silence was no longer strength but surrender? Where you knew speaking up wasn't about you anymore, but about stopping something much bigger? Let me know, because that's where I was. This wasn't just about a wedding, or a father's betrayal, or a sister's disregard. This was about an admiral who risked the lives of an entire crew to impress investors. And that admiral just happened to be sitting at the front row of my sister's wedding, laughing beside my father, their alliance sealed with stock options and secrets. I didn't sleep that night. I reviewed documents, cross-referenced chain of command logs, and searched for a name that had haunted me for years, Captain David Egan. If I could find him, if he would speak, then I'd have more than evidence. I'd have a witness. The wedding wasn't just going to be a celebration. It was going to be the stage. And they wouldn't even see it coming. While I waited for Ben to send the documents, I scrolled back through the high-resolution photos from Eliza's engagement party. Not out of sentiment, there was none left, but out of habit, the kind that years of intelligence work had carved into my brain. I was trained to notice details most people ignored. Facial expressions, background shadows, reflections in glass. But what caught my attention wasn't in the background. It was around Eliza's neck. A gold locket, intricate, too heavy for decoration alone, resting just above her collarbone. In the captions, someone had tagged it as a gift from the Croft Legacy Foundation. That name set something in me buzzing. Croft didn't give gifts without a reason. And he certainly didn't fund foundations unless there was a return on investment. I enlarged the photo, zooming in slowly. The locket had a strange seam along one edge, barely visible but not ornamental. A design flaw, no. A compartment. I stared at it for a long time. I thought of Croft seated beside my father at the rehearsal dinner, the two of them leaning in close, exchanging low laughs and guarded whispers. I thought of Eliza, always the oblivious centerpiece so used to being adorned, she never questioned the source of her sparkle. And I thought of my family's obsession with image, their love for prestige, for symbols of power that disguised weakness. I encrypted the image and forwarded it to Ben with a single line: "Analyze this object. Highest priority." Then I sat back and realized something cold and unshakable. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about exposure. Croft wasn't just a coward. He was playing long games, using my sister, my family, and our name as cover. I wasn't sure what the locket contained, yet data recording device, encrypted storage, but I was certain it wasn't just jewelry. Croft never moved without a plan, and neither would I. Have you ever noticed a small detail, something others would miss, that changed everything you thought you knew? Tell me in the comments, because that gold locket turned a family scandal into a potential national breach. I wasn't just going to walk into that wedding to reclaim my dignity. I was going to expose the rot underneath their designer suits and polished speeches. I closed my laptop not to rest, but to breathe deep, slow, calculated breaths. The air in my hotel room felt cleaner than it had in days. The kind of air that comes before a storm. That locket, that dinner, that seating chart near the kitchen, they were all pieces of the same design. They had tried to bury me in etiquette and seating arrangements. But they'd forgotten who they were dealing with. I wasn't a forgotten daughter anymore. I was the architect of their reckoning, and the first brick was already in place. By dawn, the files arrived. Ben's subject line was short, almost clinical Orion, unedited. I opened the secure folder, and within seconds the weight of memory settled onto my chest, like seawater pressing against a hull. There were transcripts of internal communications, raw audio files, surveillance footage, and logs I hadn't seen since the official inquiry years ago, ones that had been scrubbed clean before being released to the public. I listened in silence as Croft's voice cut through the speakers, crisp and cold. The asset is compromised. We will maintain perimeter and control the narrative. Potential loss of life is an acceptable risk. I knew the line by heart, But hearing it again, hearing it without edits, without spin, made my fingers curl into fists. That acceptable loss had been my crew. And then came my voice, younger but unshaken. Negative command. I am overriding that order, initiating search and rescue protocols. Now, I had forgotten how firm I sounded in that moment. Not afraid, not tentative, just resolute. I remembered the chaos, the sonar blackout, the desperate countdown to breach hull integrity. And I remembered defying Croft's direct command because it was wrong, because it would have meant abandoning men still alive, still waiting to be saved. But I needed more than recordings. I needed a voice, a face, a man who lived to tell the truth and had nothing left to lose. And I knew exactly who to call. Captain David Egan had been the commanding officer of the USS Orion before his forced early retirement. A quiet, competent leader, more sailor than politician. He had vanished from the spotlight after the incident. His career quietly ended, his name buried under bureaucracy. But I never forgot him. A quick search showed he was living in Mystic, Connecticut, less than 2 hours from Newport. I dialed the number with a steady hand, not sure if he'd even pick up. He did. "Captain Egan," I said, "this is Elena Vance." There was a pause, then a shift. His voice warmed immediately. "Commander Vance?" He corrected me using the rank I held back then. "I'd never forget your voice." I explained the situation, careful with the details, but clear in purpose. My sister's wedding. Croft will be there. So will my father. The truth needs a witness. I'm preparing to make everything public. Another pause. Then a quiet breath. "That son of a..." He muttered, his tone laced with something between fury and relief. "Good. Then so will I. It's about damn time someone told the real story. Have you ever had someone step forward without hesitation, simply because they knew what was right?" That's what Captain Egan gave me. Not just his testimony, but his loyalty. In that moment, I wasn't just planning a confrontation. I was building a tribunal. The Vance-Croft alliance had spent years hiding behind legacy. But legacy means nothing when truth walks into the room with a uniform and a witness. With Captain Egan on board, everything began to lock into place. I wasn't nervous. I was focused. Planning this wasn't so different from preparing a classified briefing or a field deployment. You map the terrain, identify your allies, assess the enemy's blind spots, and deploy your assets with precision. The battlefield in this case wasn't a desert or a destroyer. It was an opulent ballroom at the Chandler at Cliff Walk. And the weapons weren't missiles or maneuvers. They were facts, voices, and timing. I had less than 48 hours to turn that wedding into something they'd never forget. I called Ben again. "We're going live," I said. "Understood," he replied without hesitation. Ben had already looped in 2 trusted officers, men I'd served with in the North Sea, both former tech specialists who now worked civilian side in event operations. By the time the wedding started, one of them would be embedded with the AV team at the venue. The projector, the audio feed, the slide presentation, they'd all be in place. One signal from Ben, and the curated slideshow of Eliza's pre-wedding bliss would vanish, replaced by sonar maps, audio logs, and Egan's testimony. It wouldn't be a scene. It would be an unveiling. My uniform was pressed. My shoes were polished. My stars gleamed. I laid everything out across the hotel bed that morning like a soldier laying out armor before battle. I had never used my rank for personal gain. I had never pulled strings. But now I wasn't using it for myself. I was using it for the men who almost didn't come home. For the truth that had been buried beneath Navy politics and dinner party reputations. This wasn't revenge. This was exposure. Have you ever felt that click inside your chest the moment when you stop questioning yourself and begin preparing for what's next because you know it's time? I felt it then. That click was purpose, and it was louder than any apology they could have offered. That afternoon, I drove to the Chandler in silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from sadness. This one came from certainty. The sun glittered on the Atlantic just beyond the bluff, but my eyes stayed forward. When I arrived, I didn't go to the bridal suite or check in with my parents. I walked the perimeter, met briefly with my contact inside AV, confirmed the timestamp for the projection switch. Everything was in place. Then I walked to the front of the ballroom, scanned the layout, and confirmed the seating arrangement. Sure enough, I was placed in the very last row, farthest from the altar. Exiled in plain sight. Good. That's exactly where I wanted to be. Because when Ben stood when the salute was given, and when the truth lit up those screens, it wouldn't come from the front of the room. It would rise from the back where they thought they'd buried me. And when it did, no one would ever forget the name they worked so hard to erase. The morning of the wedding, I rose before the sun. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't need to. I'd spent years preparing for moments like this, not with vengeance in mind, but with clarity. I stood in front of the mirror, fastening each part of my service dress white uniform with ritual precision. Every button, every crease, every ribbon told a story they'd never cared to ask about. I looked at my reflection not with vanity, but with resolve. This was the version of me they had always refused to acknowledge. And this was the version walking into that ballroom today. I arrived early, parking a discreet distance from the valet circle. Let them wonder. Let them gossip. I walked through the lobby without flinching, my heels echoing against the marble like gunfire in a church. Heads turned. Staff straightened their posture. A few guests froze mid-sip as I passed. I wasn't wearing their language of power, no jewels, no silk, no polished champagne laugh. I wore truth. I wore command. I wore the stars they called an embarrassment. I reached the ballroom doors and paused, not to hesitate, but to observe. Through the crack, I could see the front rows, filling my father in a custom tuxedo chatting with Croft. My mother, clutching a champagne flute, pearls resting on her collarbone like armor. Eliza, surrounded by bridesmaids in blush satin, radiant and oblivious. They were exactly as I had imagined, confident in the belief that they had set the stage for their perfect day. And then I entered. The hush fell almost instantly. Like a ripple, it moved from the front to the back. Conversations stalled. Chairs turned. I didn't rush. I walked with the deliberate pace of a woman who'd marched down gangways and through fire drills, who'd stood on storm-battered decks with nothing but instinct and steel to hold her steady. I made no eye contact. I didn't need to. The uniform did all the speaking. I reached the back row, my assigned seat near the exit, the symbolic edge of their world, and sat without a word. From there I had the perfect view. The altar, the screens, the front table where Croft would sit smiling. The legacy they built was all there, stacked neatly, polished bright, just waiting to be lit from underneath. Have you ever walked into a room where every person expected your silence, and instead, you arrived wrapped in the proof of everything they denied? Tell me in the comments, because that was the moment I stopped being their shadow. I didn't wear the beige dress. I wore the truth, and as I sat in the final row, calm and still, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt positioned. Because, from that vantage point, I wouldn't just witness the collapse. I'd control its timing. The ceremony began like any other high society wedding, polished, rehearsed, and hollow. The string quartet played something classical and forgettable. The officiant stood beneath an arch of imported roses, his voice measured, his smile practiced. Eliza floated down the aisle in a custom gown that cost more than a year's tuition at the academy, her face radiant under a veil of curated perfection. My mother dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. My father stood tall, basking in borrowed pride. And Vice Admiral Harrison Croft sat just a few seats away from them, his uniform immaculate, his medals gleaming, his presence unchallenged. Until it wasn't. The officiant cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to honor those who serve in our nation's armed forces, those who may be with us today." It was the moment I had scripted down to the second. And just like that, Ben Carter stood. He wore his service dress white uniform, pressed sharp, his posture unyielding. A murmur swept through the guests, Most assumed it was just a polite gesture. But then he turned. He didn't just stand to face the altar. He turned his back to it. He turned to face the crowd, to face me. With military precision, he raised his hand to his brow in a salute that cut through the silence like a blade. Then, in a calm, even voice that carried to every corner of the ballroom, he said, "Rear Admiral Elena Vance, ma'am." The room gasped. You could feel the breath leave their lungs. Heads snapped in my direction. All at once they saw me. Not as the sister, not as the background, not as the ghost. As the highest-ranking officer in the room, my mother's hand flew to her pearls. My father went pale. Eliza froze mid-smile, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. And then the screens behind the altar, previously showing a slideshow of smiling childhood photos, went black. A moment of flicker. Then came the sonar maps. The deep blue scan of the Orion's last mission. The murmurs turned into confusion. And then into fear. Have you ever watched a room full of people realize that the version of you they've crafted no longer exists, and that the truth is now in control? Tell me, because that was the moment the tide turned. The moment they knew they weren't the ones narrating this story anymore. Ben lowered his salute and remained standing. The screens held steady, flickering with classified footage, now declassified by necessity. Croft sat motionless, his jaw tight. He hadn't stood. He hadn't turned. But I could see the sweat start to rise along his temple. Because he knew what was coming. And this time, no one would cut the feed. The ballroom plunged into stunned silence as the sonar maps gave way to something colder, clear audio from the Orion incident. Croft's voice filled the space, played through the speakers meant for wedding vows. The asset is compromised. We will maintain perimeter and control the narrative. The potential loss of life is an acceptable risk. The words rang out clinical and inhuman. Guests shifted in their seats. Someone gasped audibly. My mother's smile collapsed into something brittle and unnatural. My father looked around, searching for a signal that this was a mistake, a prank, anything but real. Then came my voice, years younger, firm and commanding. Negative command. I am overriding that order. We are initiating search and rescue protocols now. My voice echoed with urgency, resolve, and defiance. The screen behind the altar split into live footage captured from deep-sea recovery drones, twisted hull-shredded metal, and the flailing debris field of the USS Orion's near death. Croft shot to his feet. "This is slander!" he shouted, his voice sharp and cracking. This data is falsified, but no one moved to support him. No one stood. My father followed, trying to salvage control. "There's been a technical glitch. This isn't real. Someone hacked the system." His voice sounded weak, hollow. He was a man whose empire had started to burn, and didn't yet realize there was no exit. Before they could reclaim the narrative, another figure stood. Older. Worn, but steady. "My name is David Egan," he said, his voice amplified without a microphone. "I was the commanding officer of the USS Orion. That recording is real. That footage is real. Vice Admiral Croft left us to die to protect his career." The room fell into a deeper silence than before, this one filled with dread. Then Egan turned and pointed directly at me. "And that woman in the back, the one you seated by the exit like a forgotten cousin. She was then Commander Vance. She defied a coward's order and saved my crew." He straightened his civilian clothes, stiff with pride. And though he wasn't in uniform, he gave me a crisp, deliberate nod of salute. It was more than symbolic. It was testimony. Have you ever had someone speak the truth you carried for years out loud in front of everyone who denied it? That's what Captain Egan gave me. And it broke whatever illusions still lingered in that room. Phones came out. Cameras flashed. People whispered and filmed and uploaded in real time. There was no putting the story back in the box. The Vance Croft legacy, built on curated lies and quiet coercion, wasn't cracking. It was shattering right there in front of the floral arrangements and champagne glasses. And I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The truth was already louder than any toast they had planned. The aftermath erupted like a dam finally bursting. Guests rose from their seats, some backing away from the front row, others whispering with phones in hand, capturing every moment. What was meant to be the social event of the season had turned into a scandal unraveling in real time, streamed, posted, archived forever. The opulence of the ballroom, the chandeliers, the monogrammed menus, the champagne towers now looked absurd beneath the weight of raw, unfiltered truth. Croft tried to leave. He stepped forward, heading for a side exit near the bar, but Ben and two other officers, both in uniform, stood quietly in his path. They didn't touch him. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their presence was the wall he couldn't breach. My father stood nearby, sputtering. "This is a mistake, a fabrication. We'll sue. We'll bury this in legal action." But even his voice had lost its rhythm. He sounded like a failing engine trying to spark a fire in a room that had already gone cold. I remained seated. I didn't move. I let it all unfold. The venue's security, clearly overwhelmed, tried to regain control. Eventually, they escorted the key players, my parents Eliza Croft and me, into a private drawing room just off the main hall. The air inside was heavy with sweat, panic, and anger. The door shut behind us, sealing off the noise. Silence followed, thick, unstable, like the seconds before a blast. My mother was the first to speak. She didn't scream. She hissed. "How could you? You've ruined everything, our reputation, your sister's wedding years of work, gone in one selfish stunt." Her voice shook not with grief, but with rage. My father pointed a finger at me, trembling with fury. "You'll pay for this, Elena. I swear to God you will pay." But they didn't scare me. Not anymore. They sounded like people shouting from the deck of a ship that had already gone under. I looked at them, really looked at them. My mother red-faced and furious behind a mask of pearls and denial. My father trying to conjure authority from a voice that had lost its audience. Eliza, streaks of mascara running down her face, her designer gown now wrinkled and forgotten. She clutched my arm, her voice cracking. "Please, just say it was a mistake. Please, Elena, you've ruined my day." I slowly pried her hand off my sleeve. "Your most important day," I said evenly, "was financed by a cover-up that nearly killed dozens of men. That's the truth. Live with it. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who spent their lives diminishing you and realized you were no longer the one on trial?" That's where I was. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't defending myself. I was just watching the truth do what it always does, stand unshaken, while the lies scatter like ash. The confrontation ended not with screaming, but with footsteps. Firm, deliberate, undeniable. The door to the drawing room opened and two grim-faced individuals in dark suits stepped in, credentials clipped to their belts. Behind them were two uniformed Newport police officers, eyes scanning the room like they already knew who they were here for. My mother's voice caught in her throat. My father sat down hard in a nearby armchair as if someone had finally cut the strings holding him upright. But the agents didn't look at them. They looked at Croft. Vice Admiral Harrison Croft, one of them said, voice cold and formal. "You are under arrest on suspicion of obstruction of justice and falsification of national defense intelligence in connection with the Orion incident." The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. The sound of handcuffs clicking around his wrists was louder than any accusation I could have made. He didn't speak. He didn't protest. He just stood there, pale and shaking, stripped of his illusion. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched. As they led him out, my father tried to rise again, but his knees buckled. My mother reached for him, but stopped short as if even she couldn't summon the performance anymore. Eliza looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Not contempt, not envy. Fear. Like she was finally seeing me for what I was, not the sister in the shadows, but the one who had walked through fire and come out steel. She stepped forward again, her voice ragged. "Elena, where are you going?" I looked at her at all of them, and for the first time in decades, I answered without hesitation. "I'm going where I belong," I said quietly. "And it is no longer here." I turned, walked to the door, and didn't look back. I didn't need to. There was nothing left in that room worth carrying. Have you ever walked away from something that once held power over you and felt nothing but peace in its collapse? That's what that moment was. Not victory, not triumph, just silence. The kind that follows after a storm has finally broken and the world starts to breathe again. Outside the hallway was buzzing. Guests murmured. Phones flashed. The story had already gone viral. The empire of Vance and Croft was now public record, and no spin would clean it up. I passed by the ballroom, now half empty. The music silenced the cake untouched. I stepped into the late afternoon air, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt light. Not because I'd won, but because I had stopped carrying a legacy that was never mine to bear. Weeks passed. The scandal dominated the news cycle for days, but like everything in the world of the powerful, it eventually faded, replaced by newer scandals, newer names. Croft was facing a court-martial. My father's firm hemorrhaged investors. The wedding was predictably canceled. I didn't care. I didn't follow the details. That chapter was closed. What mattered to me was what came after. One afternoon, I was walking along the waterfront in Norfolk. It was quiet, just the gulls, the lapping water, the steady hum of a distant carrier drifting into port. I wore no uniform that day, just jeans and a jacket, just another woman blending into a naval town she had long called home. I paused by a bench to take in the breeze when I heard a hesitant voice behind me. "Excuse me? Are you Admiral Vance?" I turned to find a young woman barely 30 pushing a stroller. Her voice shook slightly. "My husband, he was on the Orion. He talks about you all the time." Her eyes welled with tears. "He says he wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." I froze, not out of discomfort, but from the weight of being seen for something real. Not for my title, not for my uniform, but for the human cost of choices made in silence. The little girl in the stroller, no more than 5, reached toward me with something clutched in her tiny hand, a crayon drawing of a gray ship and a figure in white with gold stars on her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. My throat tightened. I knelt, took the drawing gently, and nodded. "You're welcome, sweetheart. Have you ever had a stranger give you the very validation your family never could share it with me? Because that moment was everything. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true." That night, back in my office, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the velvet box, the brass compass, the one Eliza had left on the table like a coaster. Ben had retrieved it quietly that night, handed it to me with nothing but a nod. I placed it on my desk beside my command insignia. Not as a relic, as a reminder. A new kind of North. Not theirs. Mine. The next spring, I was invited back to Annapolis. A plaque had been commissioned, quiet, unadorned, mounted in Memorial Hall. It bore the names of the Orion's crew and honored the actions that saved them. My name was etched there too, not shouted, not marketed, just written into history the way truth deserves to be. And as I stood before it, flanked by Ben and a handful of gray-haired sailors I once called crew, I realized something simple and whole. I hadn't burned a bridge. I'd built one. And this time, I wasn't walking it alone. Sometimes the legacy we chase isn't the one we were born into. It's the one we choose to build piece by piece. In silence, in service, and in truth. If your family has ever made you feel like you were too much too different or too inconvenient, remember this: their approval isn't your compass. Your values are. And the people who truly see you will never ask you to shrink. Have you ever lived through a moment like mine, one where you chose your integrity over their comfort? Tell me in the comments. If this story meant something to you like it did to me, Please like, share, and subscribe to Subtle Revenge Stories. Thank you for listening truly.